my name is Reverend Dr. Lisa W. Davison. I am the Johnny Ergel Cadjo Professor of Hebrew Bible at Phillips Theological Seminary, where I also serve as the Director of Formation for students who are part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I'm really happy to be offering this presentation about what the Bible does and doesn't say in regard to homosexuality specifically, sexuality in general. And I thought I'd begin with just a brief moment of how I came to be doing this work, which I think I've been making these presentations for at least 15 years. When I met my first openly gay person, I'm sure I'd met more, but when I encountered this first person, I was a student at seminary, and he was a wonderful person, dedicated to his call to ministry, and I just thought, well, of course he should be a minister, and never gave it a second thought. Unfortunately, that's not how many people in the church felt. At that point, I named myself an ally and always spoke well of my friends who were part of the LGBTQIA+ community. However, that's where it stopped. If I was asked, I would speak. About, 10 years later or less, I moved to Lexington, Kentucky. And when I got there, after a year, the city council was considering a fairness amendment. And that fairness ordinance actually was going to prohibit people from discriminating against folks because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And as you might imagine, it caused an uproar. And one night I was watching the city council meeting on TV because I didn't want to get involved. And I listened to person after person come to the mic claiming to be a Christian and spouting off biblical texts. In particular, they were referencing the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the language went something like this, this is wrong. You know what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. God destroyed them because of homosexuality. And it just kept going. Well, finally I'd had enough because I knew something about that story in Genesis 19. And I went into the office. I typed up a letter to the editor, my very first one. And because I could submit it via the internet, I sent the letter off. If I'd had to find a stamp and an envelope and all that, it might never have been sent. Well, I happened to be going out of town for the weekend, and when I came back, I never thought my letter would get published. So I was checking voicemail at the office, and the first voicemail was something like, "How dare you call yourself a minister?" And it went on like that, several different voice messages in that tone. And I thought, what in the world have I done? And then I got a voicemail from the registrar of the school who said, "Thank you, Lisa, for your letter to the editor." Aha, that explained those voicemails. And so I went online, saw that my letter had been published, saw that there had been many responses, some positive, some negative. And I realized for the first time that while I thought I could be a silent ally, being silent meant I wasn't an ally at all. And from that moment on, I began dedicating some of my time to helping people understand what the Bible actually says in regards to human sexuality. I made presentations in congregations on Saturday morning for gathered people. I made presentations to more secular settings, all from Kentucky to Washington State. And so today I continue that dedication of trying to be a vocal ally for the LGBTQIA+ community. What we will look at are the so-called clobber passages that get pulled out when people want to say how bad homosexuality is, and they are pulled completely out of context. My intent today is not to change minds on the topic of sexual orientation and gender identity. Rather, what I hope to do is walk through these biblical texts, help us get a better understanding of how we can read and interpret those passages, and then allow people to think for themselves that even if you still want to not think it's okay to welcome people regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, you can't use the Bible as your weapon. So, since you don't know a lot about me, I thought I'd begin the presentation talking about some basics of how I interpret texts. The first basic is to think about what is the Bible. Now, I could get lots of answers from Word of God to the dusty old book that sits on the shelf. But I want to start with a couple of things that the Bible is not, but often is called. The first thing is the Bible is not any kind of objective history. Now, I want to stop and say, really, we know objective history doesn't exist because the historian has to choose which events to record and interprets those events for their audience. But certainly when we get to the biblical text, they were not trying to write a history of this area known as Syria, Israel, Palestine, the Cisjordan. Rather, it's a story that talks about relationships between people and the divine. So we can't go and look at it and ask it historical questions and expect it to be completely accurate. The other thing the Bible is not is a science textbook. And this one, I think, is often how the Bible is treated. People will turn to the Bible for some sort of scientific answer. And surprisingly, they're not going to find that answer. For example, when people ask me, what does the Bible say about stem cell research? I can easily say absolutely nothing because they didn't even know a cell existed. When we go to the Bible asking it scientific questions, we're really asking it to do something it was never intended to offer. So then what is the Bible? Well, there are lots of ways that I like to think about the Bible. I think of it as a story, or actually a collection of stories, a library, if you will, of a people who claim common heritage, common God, and common hopes and dreams. It is a theology book. It is focused on how humanity and creation connect with the divine. But it's not a systematic theology. If you ask a question like, who is God and what is God's nature, the answer you find in the Bible depends on where you look. I also think of the Bible as a roadmap that has been left for us by our previous faith ancestors. It's there so we can know that we're not the first people to travel this road and ask difficult questions. And I think it's also there so that we might learn from our ancestors' wrong decisions. The Bible is also like a mirror. We can hold up the Bible and find ourselves in the stories there. But we have to be careful because when we read those stories, we typically want to put ourselves in the category of the ones that are on God's side, when many of us may not be that character in the story, at least all the time. The Bible is a compilation of voices, as I said, a library written across generations, time and space and geography. We also know, though, that not all the voices were included. As is often the case, those with authority were the ones who wrote the Bible, or at least compiled the stories that were included in the Bible. And the last reminder, I think, about the Bible is that it is a dangerous book. When the Jewish leaders gathered after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in around 70 CE, they got together and discussed what might be authoritative texts for the Jewish communities of that time. What we know is that they debated lots of texts, and the kind of standard they set up was to ask the question, does the scroll make the hands unclean? Now that's the English translation of a Hebrew word, tameh, which really has nothing to do with being dirty. In fact, tameh is an indication that a person or an object is in an altered state, not in their normal state. And this change can happen from a variety of experiences. For one thing, if you are sick, you are tamei until you are healed and declared whole. If you have a child, you are tamei after the childbirth. When you come in contact with death, you can be considered tamei. So that word tamei as an altered state, some might even say an extra holy state, is how those conversations went in the 1st century CE. And if a scroll was determined to make the hands tamei, it was included. If it didn't, then it was not considered sacred. What I think that helps us to remember as we approach the biblical text is that they can be used to deal death or to deal life. And too often, those within the greater Christian community have used the biblical text to be a weapon to deal death to those in the LGBTQIA community. We want to make certain we don't do that. Another part of this discussion is to ask the question, who wrote the Bible? Now, some people will say, well, of course, God wrote the Bible. Fell from heaven, King James English, all there. Others might say that humans wrote the Bible, that it was completely a human effort, no divine intervention at all. So typically they don't hold the Bible as important in their lives. There is a third answer, which is where I stand, and I don't think it's really straddling the fence when I say that the creation of the biblical text were a human divine effort. That yes, there might have been divine inspiration, but it came through human subjects, which means it filtered through their own biases and limited understandings. And one way I imagine this combined effort is like a dance. The human and the divine are dancing as they're creating these texts, these stories, these other pieces of information. And sometimes the divine takes the lead and we get wonderful texts like love your neighbor as yourself. And sometimes the human takes the lead, maybe even leaves the divine sitting on the bleachers, and we get texts that are clearly biased and unacceptable in the 21st century. So that's a little bit about who wrote the Bible and how people answer that question, which is directly linked to the idea of biblical authority. Now remember, authority is something that must be granted. It is not inherent. And so some people grant authority to the Bible, other people do not. And if they don't grant the authority to the Bible, then it can't be used in arguing for a case. And even those who might claim authority for the Bible, be it the Hebrew Bible among Jews, the Tanakh, or the whole Christian and Roman Catholic Protestant canons, will say that they probably offer authority more to some things, some parts than others. That's an interesting idea. How do we grant authority to these texts? Well, I would say that, again, it's a combination of the text, our reason, our experience, and traditions that we have received over the centuries, that these millennia even, that these biblical texts have been interpreted and shared in community. But we ask, what kind of authority do we grant? How much authority? Which texts have more authority? Is there a canon within a canon? Many people grant more authority in the Christian community to the writings claimed to be from Paul than they even do to the Gospels. So we have to be aware of that part of this conversation. I often hear people identify themselves as biblical literalists. You may have met some people, or you may think you're a biblical literalist. But that is not accurate. You cannot take the whole Bible literally because there are conflicting answers, like how many animals went on Noah's Ark. Depends on which chapter in Genesis you're reading. I had an encounter with a woman who believed she was a biblical literalist, was flopping her Bible at me, quoting scripture, saying she took it all literally. And so once I calmed her down and said, well, let's have some conversation here. You say you take the entire Bible literally. And she said, yes. I said, well, let me ask you this. When Jesus said, go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor, doesn't look like you've done that yet. And she looked at me dead serious and said, he didn't mean that literally. So there's the problem. Everybody is a selectivist when it comes to the Bible. People select which text they're going to give more authority, which text they might take literally, and which text they aren't going to hold to, which texts they think are no longer relevant. That's a process of interpretation. And what's important is to know how you make those decisions. How do we decide which texts are timeless and which texts are time-bound, as my former colleague Dennis Smith used to say? Well, that, in my line of work, is called the hermeneutic, the interpretive lens through which we evaluate these texts. And what I think is important is to have a consistent hermeneutic. So no matter where you turn in the Bible, you're using that same interpretive framework to figure out whether this text still has value or whether this text is so time-bound and culturally biased, limited, that it can't speak in a 21st century world. As I said, this hermeneutic, this framework, does need to be applied to all texts consistently. And one must be able to name their hermeneutic, which involves naming their reading location. Where we are, what we bring to a text does influence how we read it, so we need to be aware of that. Now, too often, like the woman I encountered in the past, I think their hermeneutic for what to take literally and what not to take literally is, does it step on my toes? If it steps on my toes, it's not literal. If it requires me to sell everything I have and give it to the poor or keeps me from eating bacon, it's not literal. But if it steps on someone else's toes, I hold to it literally. That is not how we should approach interpretation of texts. So since you're going to be listening to me interpret, I'm going to share with you my hermeneutic. As one who seeks to follow the life and teachings of Jesus, the ways of Jesus, if you will, it's no wonder that my hermeneutic is shaped by what we can know about Jesus from the Gospels. And there are stories in the Gospels where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And his response is, you shall love the Lord your God with all you are. A lot of people think Jesus made that up, but he didn't. He just turned to Deuteronomy 6:5. Well, didn't turn, but it was already there as part of the Torah for the Jewish communities. When asked what the second greatest commandment was, Jesus said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that too wasn't made up. It comes from Leviticus. Leviticus 19:18, of all places. And that text goes on to say later that you should love your stranger too. Not just the person like you or who lives with you, but the stranger in your midst. So when I read biblical text, that's the framework I'm sifting through. And if a text I read, like in the Deuteronomy, go and kill all the Canaanites, I run that through my hermeneutic. It doesn't help me love God with all I am. It doesn't help me love my neighbor as myself. Then I don't get to throw it out. But I have to interpret it with great intent to figure out why that text is there. What were the ancient storytellers doing with that text? And when I come across this text, like love your neighbor as yourself, or 1 Corinthians 13, I ask those questions. Does it teach me to love God with all I am? And does it teach me to love my neighbor as myself? And the answer seems to be yes. But I still have really deep exegetical work to do to make certain I'm not making that text say what I want it to say. So with that in mind, I'm just going to run through a few of the questions I ask when I am interpreting the text. Some people use the word exegesis, drawing out meaning from the text. I will ask questions like, what are the actual words? Not what people have told me, but what are the actual words? What genre of literature are we reading? What is the socio-historical context reflected in this text, but also when the text was being created? How does it relate to the rest of the canon, whether it's the Tanakh or the Christian canons? What ideology or ideologies are expressed in the text? What is this text trying to convince me to believe or to do? Whose voice is not heard in the text? And what can this text mean for today in a 21st century world with all we know that our faith ancestors did not have at their access? So let's move on then and get to that topic of sex, which is not a 4-letter word, but in the church it's often treated that way. Sex in the Hebrew Bible is something that usually surprises people. One, there's a lot there, but two, that in the Hebrew Bible, sex is not inherently bad or dirty. It's a God-given blessing when shared between consenting adults. In fact, in Genesis 1, the first commandment that God gave to the humans was to be fruitful and multiply. Go have sex. Sex is about companionship, about helping people be a better version of themselves. It has the potential to be a sacred act. If you don't believe that, read Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, as it's often called. One book in the Bible filled with erotic poetry. But like many gifts, sex has the potential to be harmful when it's used to abuse another person. Because the text in the Hebrew Bible developed in an ancient Near Eastern context, think about the Fertile Crescent you may have read about in school, that southern portion in particular, where the Cisjordan, the land of Israel, Palestine, developed. We need to know a bit about that context, the socio-historical backdrop. One thing we know is that survival of a people was a primary concern. A famine, a disease, a war, all those things could wipe out an entire population. So life had to be treasured. For women, pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous. Many women died in childbirth, and many infants didn't survive past the age of 2 or 3. When we turn this to Israel's context, Israel was never a large population. They did not rival the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or any of those other populations. So really, reproduction was of utmost importance. But how did they understand reproduction? Well, given the agricultural context of ancient Israel, they understood procreation through that lens. And in their mind, the male had the seed that had all of the potential for life in it. Then the male planted that seed into the field that was the woman. If that seed grew into a son, who celebrated? Who got the credit? Well, obviously the man, because the seed did it. if that seed grew into a female child, which might be loved, but were not as valued in that culture, why did that happen? Who gets the blame? Well, the field, obviously. And if that seed is planted and no child develops, it's clearly the problem of the woman, and that's why women were called barren, like a barren field. Now, we know so much more about how human reproduction works. They didn't have that knowledge. So, with the seed that the male carried having all the potential for life, every time that seed was expelled, it had to be directed to the possibility of reproduction. This is why when we read in the Hebrew Bible, spilling seed was strictly prohibited. In fact, there's a story in Genesis 38 in which a man named Onan, who had to marry his brother's widow, and knowing that if he produced offspring with this widow, it would actually be the offspring of his brother and could mess up his own inheritance, decided not to consummate the relationship, spilled his seed on the ground, and God struck him dead. Clearly, this was a teaching moment. That seed had to be directed towards reproduction. In regard to the Hebrew Bible and homosexuality, the first thing we need to know is there was no word in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, for homosexuality. In fact, that word didn't enter the English language until the late 19th century CE. So if you read a translation of the Bible and it has the word homosexual or homosexuality, you got to question it. Now, we don't know. It's possible that biblical writers assumed everyone was heterosexual, but we doubt that would be the case of a population in the ancient Near East. So it's also possible that the biblical writers were only concerned with seed. And therefore, it didn't matter what your sexual orientation or gender identity was, as long as you fulfilled your role of producing offspring, that's what mattered. When we read about same-sex behavior in the ancient world, we know of several different types that happened. Conquered armies would often rape the soldiers that they had defeated, and this had nothing to do with sexual orientation. As we know, rape is about power. And by raping those men, it was a double insult because in their mind, the men who were being raped had to play the part of the woman on the receiving end. And to be called a woman or made to look like a woman in that culture was a negative. You didn't want that. We know that some religions had ritual sex acts as part of their cult. And again, that's not close to what we're trying to discuss today. And we also know that particularly in the Roman culture, but even other places, that older men sometimes kept young boys for their sexual pleasures as sex slaves. It was called pederasty, which we would identify as pedophilia today. Those acts are not about loving, consenting relationships between two persons who share a sexual identity or gender identity. With that background, then, we're going to run our way through these clobber passages. First one, you may have seen the sign that says God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, which is a catchy little line, but it's really not a strong argument. Obviously, those texts are referring to Genesis and the creation stories or the creation myths that are there. And like many, it kind of combines both stories instead of seeing them as separate stories. When we look at Genesis 1, 27 to 28, we read that God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them, blessed them, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." Now think about this. This is a story about how the world began. And if you're going to populate the entire world, you have to have a male and a female. This is about, again, the understandings of fertility and the necessary aspect of reproduction. It doesn't matter what their sexual orientation or gender identity might be. We have to have a male and female to fill the earth. In the second story, God creates a human out of the dirt, a human out of the humus, if you will. And that first human doesn't have a sexual specification. And when God realizes that that human needs a fitting partner, God puts the human to sleep, divides it in half, closes up the empty spaces, turns those humans to see each other, and we have, again, a man and a woman. Because they're going to have to populate the world. One of the intriguing rabbinic midrashim about this story, because we all wonder, how could a human body not have any kind of specific biological sex? The rabbis like to imagine maybe it had both organs or multiple sex organs. One imaginative interpretation was that first human was created with two sides, but back to back. And so it was lonely because it didn't know there was another human. So when God put the human to sleep, broke it apart, they could turn and see each other and know that they were not alone. So the story is more about finding that person that completes you, that makes you whole, that makes you a better image of the divine in this world. So those texts I don't think really have much to stand on. So we'll move to the next one, the one that got me into this business and is often the most clobberful passage, if that's a word. It's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. But the problem people have is they don't read Genesis 18 along with Genesis 19. And you have to read them together. It's part of the Sarah and Abraham saga in Genesis. In Genesis 18, 3 strange visitors come to visit Abraham and Sarah. We know they're angels, they don't. And they show them the fullness of ancient Near Eastern hospitality, which was required back then, giving them food and water and safety or shelter. That's when these 3 strangers tell Abraham that Sarah, who is well past the age of bearing children, will get pregnant and bear a son in due season. And Sarah laughs, and that's a whole nother kind of intriguing interpretation possibility. After that, the 3 strangers leave. 2 walk on down to Sodom and Gomorrah because we're told that God had heard the outcry against those cities was great, and God needed to check out whether the witnesses were accurate. One of the strangers remains standing and miraculously is recognized as God. And God tells Abraham what is about to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, God, there's got to be some righteous, innocent people there. What if I can find 50 righteous people? Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? And God says no. And so Abraham begins negotiating. Gets all the way down that if there are just 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, God will not destroy the city. Close of scene, and chapter 19 brings us to the city of Sodom. Now, we know nothing about what this outcry against the cities related to. We just know that there's a problem there. And we find Lot, who is related to Abraham, in the city square of Sodom at the end of the day. Why might he have been there? Well, what we see is that these 2 strangers, the angels, as we know, come to Sodom in the evening. And Lot sees them and goes to them and says, please spend the night with me. It's not safe to spend the night in the square. Remember, Lot's been here. He knows what it's like to be a stranger in Sodom. When they finally agree to come to his house, he too shows hospitality, like Abraham and Sarah. And then the text reads in Genesis 19, this is the New Revised Standard Version, picking up, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called out to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Take them and do with them as you will." Now, Lot might be a great host, but he's a terrible father. When the mob says no, they say, "Look, this fellow came here as a stranger and he would play the judge. Now we'll deal worse with you than with them." And when they try to get Lot, the angels open the door, pull Lot inside, and blind the crowd. And the story goes that Lot, his wife, and his daughters were able to flee the city before it is destroyed. But here's the problem with that. The way it's translated traditionally, all the men of the city, gives a picture in people's mind that the crowd outside Lot's door were simply a collection of men, nobody else. Well, there's a problem then. If God will not destroy the city for the sake of 10 righteous, innocent people, then what about the women and children who aren't at the door? When I went back to the text and looked at this verse in particular, I realized that the Hebrew is set up to create a different picture. So in 19 verse 4, at evening they lay down, this is my translation, when the people of the city, the people of Sodom, from the youngest to the eldest, all the people of Sodom to the last one surrounded the house. Hear the difference? The text actually says, Kol ha'am, all the people, not just men. There's a mad mob of men and women. Children have been brought by their parents and grandparents. Everybody is at the door of Lot wanting to know these strangers. That's how we know there weren't 10 righteous people besides Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. So what's going on here? Well, clearly the people of Sodom don't like outsiders, and they don't care about hospitality codes. I do think when it says to know them, they are indicating sex. But this is a gang rape, not about sexual orientation. This is about debasing and harming strangers so they won't come back. With all the people at the door, as I said, now we know that there weren't even 10 righteous people in Sodom. Later, when the sins of Sodom were mentioned by biblical texts, we find a variety of sins identified. Greed, abusive behavior, idolatry, inhospitality, all those we see in an attempt to gang rape strangers. Later, in the New Testament, even Jesus points to Sodom and Gomorrah as examples, the epitome of inhospitality, when he tells his disciples that if a town doesn't welcome them, they should shake the dirt from their sandals because it will be better in the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah than it will be for that town. This story is not about homosexuality. It's about inhospitality, how we treat the most vulnerable. And that letter I wrote to the editor back in Kentucky, that's what I said. You've misread the story. And actually, if we don't pass the fairness ordinance, we will be like Sodom and Gomorrah because we're not taking care of the most vulnerable in our midst. That's it. That's all there is to Sodom and Gomorrah. So now we move on to Leviticus. One thing many don't know is there are 613 commandments in the Torah. It was not a buffet law code that you pick and choose which ones you want. And they were intended for Israel. to help them live out their covenant relationship with God and neighbor and self, to help them be different from their neighbors. And only Israel was expected to follow Torah. So Leviticus, this book that nobody ever reads except maybe a few verses, is a really intriguing compilation of commandments. It's often called the Levitical book, or sometimes known as the Torah HaKohanim, the teachings of the priests. And that title helps us know that about half of the book focuses on teachings for the priest about ritual behavior, etc. And the other half are the priests to teach the rest of the community how to live a life that is holy, as the Lord their God is holy. These instructions deal with proper ordering of cultic practice, but it also has a couple of narrative stories, and it deals with other things like ethics. We may not see all of it as having an order, but obviously it did in the ancient world. The texts we're talking about come from what is called the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 through 26. And it's important to know what the Holiness Code includes. First, it says that a child should be killed if they sass their parent. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be standing here if we took that text literally. It says anyone guilty of adultery should be stoned or killed. I don't know about you, but I think that would make Hollywood a little less populated and maybe even Washington, D.C. This section of commandments also says a daughter of a priest who engages in prostitution should be killed. Well, what do we do with that today? And anyone who uses the holy name to support something God wouldn't want to be a part of, that person should be killed. Also, this holiness code has some certain things that are prohibited. Heterosexual intercourse with a woman who's menstruating is prohibited. Harvesting the corners of your field is prohibited. You're to leave that for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Crossbreeding livestock is prohibited, as is eating fruit from a young tree. And maybe one that really catches people is tattoos are prohibited. Are we going to take all those literally? Another example is you shouldn't charge interest on a loan, which I think sounds great, but my mortgage company is not going to go for that. So you just get a feel of the things that are the concerns of this ancient population and how they don't translate to today. So that when we look at the two texts from Leviticus, two verses, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, we have to read those in context. Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." And Leviticus 20:13 reads, "If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." Now remember, that may sound clear, but when you dig deeper into the Hebrew, it takes a little different tack. Here we read in 18:22, "With a male," speaking to another male, "you shall not lie the lying of a woman." That appears in 2013 as well. So why do I call attention to that? Because this text is concerned about a male playing the part of a woman in the sex act. And remember, that would be a disgrace. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. So what's that issue beyond just not wanting to be the part of a woman? Clearly, it's about wasting seed. If a man has sex with another man, the seed doesn't have the potential for reproduction. This is probably one reason why it doesn't mention two women having sex. That would not waste seed. So like I say, it's good news in the Bible for lesbians. You're all clear. Another thing that is important to understand about these texts is that word abomination. Most people think abomination is the worst sin ever and you should be killed. But that word in Hebrew is to'avah. And it has something to do with things that bring about ritual impurity. It's not the worst sin. And if we want some evidence of that, let's look at a couple other things that are called an abomination. Eating a sacrifice at the wrong time, an abomination. Eating pork or shellfish, eating your bacon or your lobster, abomination. Seeing a menstruating woman naked, abomination. Hopefully this helps us understand that those texts aren't speaking to us. They were not meant to be pulled out of context, but they had a meaning in their ancient culture. And we don't get to pick and choose in that use of those texts, unless we have a good reason. And it's not a good reason if this is your key issue and you want to stamp on people who have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. Those are all the texts in the Hebrew Bible. And when we turn to the New Testament, there's even less. In fact, if people are seeking to follow Jesus by the Gospels, he never says anything about that. Don't you think if that was God's hot button issue, Jesus would have mentioned that? When we look at the New Testament and its setting in a Greco-Roman world, we need to remember that the early followers of Jesus during this time was a minority group and a new religion. And they were trying to establish both their respect as a religion as well as keep the community united. One of the greatest threats was the Greco-Roman culture around them and the temptation to assimilate. So when we read about texts for that early community that later became the church, we find that anything that hints at outside culture and religion has to be strictly prohibited. Anything, whether it's fertility rituals or men with short hair. Women with short hair. That was a little bit of my own fun, I think. So let's go through those texts again fairly quickly. The first one comes from Romans 1, verses 26 to 27. Now, you need to understand that this text is part of a broader piece of Paul's letter to the church at Rome. The text reads, "For this reason God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error." So what's happening here? Well, that word natural, unnatural, is the Greek phrase paraphizin. And it usually has more of a meaning of unconventional or unusual. And as it kind of hinted at, Paul uses this same phrase in 1 Corinthians 11:14 in referring to men with long hair. So it can't be some sort of obvious sexual lust phrase. And this kind of behavior seems to reflect a type of orgy. And when it's not about companionship and completeness, but about getting your own joy, your own fulfillment at any cost. This kind of behavior would have been considered pagan. And so it has to be strictly prohibited. The text also says in the surrounding verses that these people were guilty of idolatry and their behavior thus became really unconscionable. Orgies, and it goes in other places to say they also were guilty of envy and gossip, etc. Nobody wants to pick that up and trot it out as we should get rid of anyone who's envious or gossips. And again, this text seems to be referring to people who are heterosexual going against their natural orientation due to their worship of idols. It has nothing to do with the physical expressions of love and intimacy by LGBTQIA persons. And it may even cause us to think, what are we doing when we force those children of God to go against their natural inclinations? The next two texts are almost parallel. They're what I call sin inventories about inheriting the kingdom of God. One is in 1 Corinthians 6, 9-10, and the other one is in 1 Timothy 1, 9-10. They read like this. In 1 Corinthians 6, do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, and robbers. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Timothy. This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for unholy and profane, for those who kill their mother and father, or for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. So what's really happening here? Well, first notice that word sodomite. That is not what that Greek word is. It's a word, arsenokotai, which is hard to translate. It has something to do with beds and male. And some think it's talking about male prostitutes, which might have been a pagan religious practice that would have to be prohibited. And that word that is translated male prostitutes is the Greek word malakoi, which means soft or has to do with lazy or weak or even being womanly. Most of the recent translations of these texts have used either the word sodomite or homosexual. But when you read or you heard me say arsenokotai, you know it doesn't sound like sodomite. And that's not what it meant. So how did it get into our translations? It's political. The translators make deals and translate texts in ways that are not helpful. I was even told that this was a I scratch your back, you scratch my back deal among the translators of the New Revised Standard Version. We'll give you this text, and you can use sodomites, though we know that's not the right word, if you'll give us something over here. I never heard what that something over here was. I've heard it was worth it, but I'm not certain I think it was worth the way that these texts have dealt death to persons whose sexual orientation and gender identity are seen as wrong. And when you look at the King James Version, it doesn't have sodomite or homosexual. And when you look at the previous RSV, it uses the word sexual perverts, not the word for homosexuality. And the other thing, again, is that people don't focus on where it says greed and lying and other things will keep you out of the kingdom of heaven, because those step on their own toes. They only point to those kinds of things that don't step on their own toes. The last text in the New Testament is simply a short text. The book of Jude doesn't have any chapters, so it's Jude 7. It reads this way: likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities were in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, serve as an example of undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Well, there's a couple of things we need to know. The writer of Jude assumes that the audience knows the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which helps them understand a couple of things. Sexual immorality, well, of course, a mob or attempted rape is sexual immorality, as is Lot offering his daughters in our eyes today. And that unnatural lust is that same phrase we saw before. And If you know the story of Genesis 19, you know that those two strangers were angels. And that kind of sexual interaction between humans and divine beings was strictly prohibited in the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament. If you don't think this was a problem, go back and read Genesis 6 for the reason the flood happened. One of the reasons is that divine beings were having sex with female humans. That's what the text is talking about. Don't do sexual immorality and don't have any kind of unnatural behavior, unconventional behavior that might make you look like the other people in our culture. There are no more texts in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament that get used because really neither the Hebrew Bible nor the New Testament speak directly to what we know today about sexual orientation and gender identity. When people want to pull these texts out and throw them at people, I always ask, would you like for your doctor to practice medicine based on what they knew in the ancient Near East? Now, there are some who might say yes, but most of them don't want to go there. So why do you want to do this? Why pick and choose, proof text your way, randomly without naming that your hermeneutic is probably more about your pet peeve or your concern and not about your own behavior? There are some sex-friendly texts that I like to throw out at the end. Those include Song of Songs, as I mentioned, this kind of great expression of physical intimacy between two people. They happen to be male and female, but there's a part in one of those poems that indicates that their relationship is not accepted by society, and the woman goes looking for her lover at night and gets beaten up. If that doesn't ring some bells from our time, we're not listening. There's the book of Ruth, where we have this phrase, wherever you go, I will go, or whither thou goest, that has been used in heterosexual weddings for forever. No one stops to look and see that those words are spoken by Ruth to Naomi, a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. We know it's about a lifelong covenantal commitment. And here in the Hebrew Bible, we have two women making that covenant. And some might like to read a little bit more about Jonathan and David. In the text, we read that their very beings were bound together. Some might say David's relationship with Jonathan was the healthiest he had. Yeah, he had a lot of wives and concubines. That never turned out well. And when Jonathan dies, David laments Jonathan's death in a song in which he says, "Your love was greater or past the love of women." Maybe the biblical writers weren't so uncomfortable with intimacy between people of the same sexual identity or gender distinction. Maybe we're reading some bias back into that. So if you have questions, you're welcome to contact me. My email will be provided. I really appreciate you taking the time and the energy to bear with me as we work through this material, and hopefully you'll continue to wrestle with texts and how to read them in ways that are responsible and life-giving. And if nothing else, the next time someone says, "What does the Bible say about sexual orientation, gender identity, same-sex relationships?" I hope you'll say, "It's not clear about that." It may not say anything that relates to what we know today of these relationships and these people.